Fatty foods like butter, cheese, and red meat have a bad reputation, but that may soon change. HHS Secretary RFK Jr. set to unveil new guidance encouraging more saturated fats in your diet.
RFK Jr. is stirring up information about saturated fat, making headlines about new guidance on saturated fat. Is he right, or is he just stirring up more controversy? Let's break it down. I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. This video is interesting. Thank you for sending me videos, by the way. It's a news report, and there's going to be an interview of a doctor about this purported change in the nutritional guidelines. If you've been following my channel and you're in the low-carb or keto world, you know that we don't fear saturated fat. We don't fear fat in the food. We don't blame the burger for what the bun did, for example. It's the carbs that raise the blood sugar and all. So it's interesting to see finally a national guideline possibly changing. Let's see what's going on. Before we dive into today's video, I want to invite you to join the Academy's free webinar, The Power of Protein: Telltale Signs You Need More Protein, hosted by Dr. Michael Eads and Dr. Mary Dan Eads. They've appeared as nutritional experts on hundreds of radio and television shows across the U.S. and continue to speak at medical and scientific conferences on the connection between diet, health, exercise, and low-carb and ketogenic diets. See the link in the description to sign up.
So here's a quote from The Hill. It says, RFK Jr. to unveil new guidance encouraging more saturated fats. Kennedy has argued that Americans need more trans and saturated fats, not less, saying foods like butter, cheese, milk, and red meat have been unfairly demonized for decades.
Yeah, that sounds like something I would have said. So it's fascinating to see a change at the national guideline level. We've been asking, or the community that I'm a scientist in and researcher and clinical practitioner in has been asking for reform on the national guideline for decades. And the story is one that's best told by Nina Teicholz, who's been in the guideline fighting domain now for years. And so the researchers, the clinicians who know the research, have never worried about saturated fat. I was first introduced to this years ago at meetings on nutrition, and the science that is now in several publications of the researchers who research saturated fat is that they have no concern about saturated fat in human health. But the researchers have to be filtered through the clinical people, and the clinical people are filtered through all sorts of other organizations that have other agendas. And so when the interviewer says that it's been demonized and has a bad reputation, it might all change. No, the fat will still have a bad reputation in some circles, but not in the scientific circles. And it's fascinating to see the control that the national guideline has had on the food. Again, Nina Teicholz is one of the best ones to listen to about how institutions, schools follow this national guideline. To have a change in saturated fat, it's high time, it's about time. This is, 20 years behind the science. And yet that's not unusual to have the science be presented and then the clinical people and then now the national policy possibly changing. I think this would be great. Now, the person they bring in as an interviewee is a rheumatologist, meaning a doctor of people who get arthritic issues or systemic issues like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, not necessarily an expert on nutrition, which is an interesting choice. Maybe that person was just available, but let's see what kind of the standard medical response is.
I mean, we have been told for decades that they're horrible for you. They lead to cardiovascular disease, maybe even cause cancer. What's changed?
Yes, this started in the 1960s, John. So we had some studies come out then that said, listen, if you swap out your saturated fats, the meat and dairy, with polyunsaturated fats like seeds, nuts, and fish, then you decrease that bad cholesterol and lower your risk of heart disease.
Of course, those were correlational, not causal research studies. If you've been watching my channel, you know if there's nutritional epidemiology, that's correlation, not causation. In fact, in Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, and in Gary Taubes' book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, they outline the science from the 1980s and 90s, how it never really proved that saturated fat was the culprit. In fact, it never really proved that LDL cholesterol was the culprit. So with that homework, so if you're brand new to this, you want to really geek out, get Gary Taubes, Good Calories, Bad Calories, Nina Teicholz, The Big Fat Surprise. If you've read these, let me know in the comments below. It's fascinating to see how that can be transformational to read. And it was for me, the science that wasn't there. So basically they're saying that the whole saturated fat being bad, even the LDL cholesterol by itself being bad, really was not based on solid science. That's a lot to swallow.
So in the 1970s and 80s, the food industry responded to this by saying, okay, we're going to swap it out, but not for the healthier fats. Instead of the saturated fats, they used sugars and tons of ultra-processed additives. And not only did this not help the heart disease issue, it caused soaring diabetes rates. So I think Secretary Kennedy is really trying to emphasize that we need to come back and have whole, nutritious foods in their original state, not so much modification. And the point about saturated fats, not all saturated fats are created equal. You can have a cup of whole milk yogurt, and you can have a highly toxic hot dog in your other hand, and they're both saturated fat, but the yogurt is going to help your gut health, and the hot dog is a known carcinogen that can cause cancer.
Now, hang on. Well, I couldn't let that one go. Actually, the saturated fat's the same regardless of what food it was in. Now, the other components of the food, I understand. I'm not afraid of hot dogs and the way that they're typically made and typically given out at stores. I know some people are worried about that. The science there is really pretty weak. The red meat causing cancer, and even then hot dogs and ultra-processed foods, to me, means Cheetos, Doritos, the Ho-Hos and Twinkies and the ultra-processed meats. Actually, they have to be processed in some way, and I think they're actually pretty healthy. So I just had to make an editorial comment there that saturated fat really has never been a culprit.
I think the bottom line with all of this is we can all agree there is no one perfect diet. People have different dietary needs. And I think what's really going to come out of all of this is, as a society, we have to limit our salt, sugar, and ultra-processed food consumption.
Well, again, that's kind of the mainstream position, isn't it? Where salt is put in there with the sugar and the ultra-processed foods. Salt is not actually a problem if you don't eat the carbs. And so the advanced course is that carbs actually make you swell and hold on to fluid. When you get rid of the carbs, you let go of the salt better, or normally we would say you don't retain it anymore. So I don't worry about the salt in the food unless you're on a blood pressure medicine or you have heart failure, kidney failure, liver failure, something like that. So a clinical concern. Again, if you're on medication and you're just getting started with this, please do this with someone who can help you get off the medicine safely. I think it's kind of expected today that the medical people would throw salt in there and sugar in ultra-processed food. I'm actually pretty happy that she's talking about sugar, and a lot of doctors wouldn't glom onto that yet.
Let's put up the current guidelines. The U.S. dietary guidelines have less than 10% of your daily calories from saturated fats. American Heart Association says less than 6%. This is not necessarily a push to endorse saturated fats, but as you pointed out, just more natural foods.
Well, if you want to know why those guidelines are the way they are, again, Nina Teicholz at the Nutrition Coalition has put together a pretty good story and narrative that it's lobbying from the companies that are helping to influence the guidelines. It's not the science. The science on low-carb diets was actually tabled during one of the guideline panels for no apparent reason. So the idea of limiting saturated fats from the U.S. government has its other agendas. Why the American Heart Association would still limit saturated fats is because they basically started the American Heart Association on limiting saturated fats. It would be like saying, well, you know, we're going to change the Catholic Church now to be Muslim because, you know, we started it on the Jesus thing and now we've changed our minds. So the American Heart Association is full of the believers of the LDL and saturated fat LDL heart disease hypothesis, which can give us some improvement in health, but I don't think it's the entire answer. So I don't think the American Heart Association is ever going to change their guideline. Other organizations have changed their guidelines as well. And it'd be great if the U.S. government did. It would be great, in my opinion, if the U.S. government would go through with taking away a saturated fat guideline like it looks like they might do.
Any idea what they may increase the consumption percentage to?
We don't know that yet. And again, still patients, it is very patient dependent. Patients with cardiovascular disease need to be more mindful of those numbers. Patients with celiac disease need to avoid gluten. My patients with autoimmunity, they do better with Mediterranean and sometimes vegan diets.
So the doctor is bringing up a good point that most Americans aren't healthy. And I actually met with the creator of the first USDA food pyramid, and it was a guideline for healthy Americans. And we tried to convince her or educate her that most Americans weren't healthy. I was lobbying or meeting with people on behalf of the Obesity Medicine Association, and we tried to explain, I believe Susan Davis was her name, explained to her that most people are not healthy. And so you can't have a healthy diet guideline for all Americans because what they mean is that this is for people who are already healthy. So meanwhile, low-carb diets, clinical trials, if they're included as an option, that'd be fantastic. There's so much data now about low-carb diets for people with insulin resistance and obesity and diabetes. I mean, look around at the mall, that's, I'm afraid, most of Americans now have some metabolic issue. So it's an important point that she brought up, the idea that Americans really are not healthy, and we need recommendations that at least include other options that can be therapeutic for, I know it seems kind of weird. You'd have a USDA, NIH governmental therapeutic guideline. Well, maybe there should be, and then there's one for otherwise healthy people once you've reversed medical problem that you've had. That would be pretty interesting.
You know, they're talking about meat consumption. Sure, you can get grass-fed, antibiotic-free beef that has higher nutritious value. They have higher omega-3 content versus the grain-fed. And I think they're going to be hopefully discussing these nuances.
Well, and then the concern about food quality is fascinating. I think it's most important to keep the carbs low. Carbs meaning sugars and starches, because starches get digested to sugar. And I've never really told people that they only can have grass-fed beef. Go to the farmer's market, get a cow locally and have it put in your freezer. In other countries, I was at a recent meeting, they do that. They know where the cow is raised and they have it that for the year. That's not the way our system is made in the U.S. And if I didn't have the ability to teach someone how to eat at a fast food place, I would not be able to teach half the patients that I see in my clinic in Durham, North Carolina. I mean, it might just be a Durham thing, but I don't think so. I think it's all over the country. So we need to teach people who are unable to get access to that super clean, expensive kind of food too. Well, I think it's a great video that talks about this new possible change in guideline, the idea of taking away a cap or upper limit on the saturated fat is long overdue, because saturated fat is not the nutrient of concern that's known by researchers and many other health organizations. And now that it's finally possibly getting to the U.S. national guideline is actually pretty exciting. I hope that they do follow through with that. The doctor interviewed here was still kind of, what doctors typically say, watch the salt, don't have a hot dog. And yet I need a more flexible way to teach people and meet people where they are. So I focus on the carbs mainly, and it's total carbs, not net, always total. I hope this is helpful. If you like this, please like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, look out for new content on Wednesdays and Fridays. If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our YouTube membership for early access and exclusive live Q&As with me. Just click the join button below or support us with a PayPal in the description.